Well, greetings everyone, and welcome to another edition of God's Unchanged Word and News, Nuggets, and Insights. Today is Friday, January 26, 2018. Lots of information as usual. In fact, this week we had a difficult time weeding out what we wanted to cover because there's just so much information going on. So our focus this week, we're going to talk about Christian persecution. We haven't talked about that in a while. There's some things going on that we need to make you aware of. And then we're going to talk about the economy, the government debt, the shutdown that's been temporarily averted, as you know, for 3 more weeks until they go back into the same hassles that they had before. And then we're going to conclude our coverage on Mardi Gras. This is actually part 3 of a 3-part series of Mardi Gras, talking about the plan of Satan. So let's begin with the Christian persecution. Something that came out this week was a new way or a new means by which the persecution is continuing to increase. It's a new Boko Haram strategy, and what they're doing is they're sending in mass suicide bombers one after another to be able to counter the protection that the governments are trying to give its people. So this came out on January 22nd of an incident that took place last year that was swept under the rug. It says that Boko Haram sent 10 suicide bombers into the Maiduguri town Thursday night in a wave of bomber attacks that lasted over an hour. A resident called it a rain of explosions. Quite often when you see this type of activity going on, there are test runs for other things that are going to be taking place in other places around the world. And of course, ISIS will pick up on this also. So that as we see what the terrorists are doing now, they will set off explosions in different parts of a city, and then they will bring in a main attack to be able to destroy the people, to create the most havoc and the most loss of life that there is. So we're seeing this beginning to take place in many places over in the Middle East and also the Far East, as we see right here. The persecution. All right, so now I want to bring you something, a list that just came out that you may not be aware of. Is from an organization called Open Doors. Now that's an international organization that's, his whole mission is to help those Christians who are being persecuted around the world. So what they've came out with recently, just a couple weeks ago, is what they call a world watch list of the 50 countries where the most dangerous to follow Jesus. So what they're doing is they're making the world aware of the countries and the persecution that takes place. You're going to be shocked what I'm about to show you that's going on right now in our news and around the world, the UN, and all the static that you hear coming out of the UN. You're going to find out how false it really is and how deadly this Christian persecution is that continues to grow in this end of the age. So now, Open Doors. According to Open Doors, the human rights organization, 215 million Christians experience high levels of persecution around the world. Now, this is various forms of persecution. What they're talking about is a heightened persecution to extreme persecution. 215 million Christians. Can you believe that? Now, you're not hearing this anywhere in the news. Consider the Pope now. Now think about this, who seems to want to get involved in all walks of life, in our government, and the way things are being handled here in America. Where's the voice of the Vatican here? 215 million Christians being persecuted. The recently released World Watch List in 2018 ranks the 50 of the world's worst nations. Now what I've put up here is in this picture, this is a militiaman from Nineveh. I said, wow, this is interesting, from Nineveh, in a plane protection unit. And this is a Christian who's actually been armed to help protect Christians over in the Far East. This was taken November 8th, 2016. And where he's walking into was a Christian church that was destroyed by ISIS. In fact, when they go in, they just wipe out everything, Christians, buildings, the entire Mecca of people as they go in. Here's the reports from 2017. So you ready for this? So get ready to share with you what was being put in this report. This is from 2017. Just last year, 3,066 Christians were killed under persecution. That's 1 year. Where's the news? Another 1,252 were abducted and assumed to be killed. In other words, they just disappear. Someone come in and capture and take them away. Sometimes they hold them for ransom to help fund the terrorist organizations, but most of the time, they're never seen again. Another 1,020 were raped or sexually harassed on account of their faith. A Christian organization is reporting this. Where is the governments and where is the UN? And another 793 churches were attacked or destroyed. All of that going on in 1 year. Now, this has been taking place year after year after year for quite some time now. So now, here are the countries. This is the top 10 countries that are worse for the persecution. And some of this is going to surprise you because it surprised me when I seen through here. All right, so I went ahead and backed it up to 15 countries because I want to show you something. Is that these are the 15 countries: Syria, Nigeria, the Maldives, Saudi Arabia. That's why I went to 15. Saudi Arabia is number 12 for Christian persecution. This is supposed to be like an ally, but for Christian persecution on the list, it's number 12. All right, going on. Number 10, Iran. That's no surprise to anyone. Yemen. Iraq, again, no surprise. Libya, no surprise. Eritrea, I think that's how I pronounce that, I'm not really sure. And then the top 5, Pakistan, the Sudan, Somalia, and Afghanistan. And if we had a drum roll, we could do a drum roll. Any guess on number 1? I was shocked when I saw this because you think persecution is basically the Arabs against the Christians, but it's not always that way. In fact, quite often it's government. Number 1, North Korea. Now I was totally surprised when I read that. So North Korea, but actually Christians quite often who follow their faith come under persecution from governments who want to operate differently and control their lives. The Human Rights Council. In the UN, there's countries who come together who form the humanitarian rights. Right? So I want you to be prepared for this. Out of the 50 countries on the humanitarian rights of the countries, of these 15 nations, let me show you something. These are the nations. Let me reinforce this now. These are the nations that's supposed to be protecting the human rights. At the same time, these 15 countries are the top 15 countries in the world where persecution and human rights is being violated. Now watch this. Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. Those 4 countries are on the UN Human Rights Council to protect human rights. Can you believe that? 4 of these 15 countries are the top countries for persecution of Christians. And yet, at the same time, they're on the Human Rights Council. What a contradiction of any moral sense of reality going on. And so how in the world can anyone trust the UN to make the decisions? It is those same countries now. Are you ready? All these countries hate Israel. It's no wonder that there is no protection for Christians in those countries because they hate it. Now, Jesus Christ told us at the end time there would be coming a persecution at the end time. In fact, we talked about people who said they gave their lives for Christ. And the majority of these Christians following a Protestant or a Catholic faith, they don't even have the truth. So you have to think about what's going on here. And you begin to wonder why Daniel, in the book of Daniel, where God talked about a scattering of his holy people at the end time. It's almost as if, because you got to understand, why would God do that? It's almost as if, because of all this going on, and Satan's hatred for the truth in Christianity and any tie to Christ himself, is that God has provided a way for His church to be underground, so to speak. In other words, out of the eyesight and out of mainstream, so that they can accomplish the work of warning this world. Now, there's going to come a time when, and especially when we see the two witnesses who come on the scene, who will actually begin to persecute the true Christians, those who have the truth, and to go after them at the very end. But until then, from what we're seeing now this is an opinion, take it for what it's worth. It appears that through the scattering of the flock that God has provided a way to protect us so that we can do the job of warning the world, as Revelation says, go again and warn the world one more time before the return of Jesus Christ. Now, there's probably a lot of other reasons, of course, the protection of His people at the same time. But for right now, we have been given a shelter to continue to preach the gospel to the world. And we need to be busy doing it, and that's what we're doing right here on God's Unchanging Word in our News Nuggets and Insights every single week. Now, this was an important issue, so I wanted to bring that in again, and we're going to talk a lot more about that as we go. Okay, moving on. Now, let's talk about something in the persecution era of what we're talking about with the Soviet Union, to show you how governments quite often are as corrupt as can be, and the persecution of Christians who don't follow their ways and what happens when they don't. Under the Soviet Union, all right, this was the Soviet Union before it collapsed, between 12 to 25 million Christians were killed for their faith. Did you know that? Between 12 to 25 million Christians. Wiped them off, just destroyed them throughout the Soviet Union. Also, approximately 153,000 churches were shut down during that period, during the period of the Soviet Union. Following the Soviet Union, post-Soviet Union now with Russia, watch the reverse of what's taken place and brings out another possibility. I want to introduce a thought in just a second. Since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, we have now seen about 1,000 churches being rebuilt every single year. So you can see how the government was controlling the Christians at the time. I'm bringing this out for a reason. Because see what's going on here? Here in America, we were beginning to see the government of America beginning to shut down the conservative Christian right. And it's as if with the election that nobody ever believed, that in this election, God has put a halt to that to protect God's people in America today. So you're seeing a parallel, a similarity of what took place in Russia and what can take place and probably will take place in the future, even here in the United States. So look what else has happened. According to the Pew Report in 2014, between 1991 and 2008, I didn't have anything more accurate than that, so it stopped at 1998, Russians identifying themselves as Orthodox Christians rose from 31% to 72% of the people in that nation. Absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. So I wanted to bring that out to you. So it brought something else in mind. So I wanted to share something with you, just a thought, because we don't know how God does these things, but this is a potential that I'm seeing of a way of what we're looking at the end time in Revelation here. Revelation 7 and verse 9 says this: After these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude, which no one could number, of all nations, tribes, and peoples and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes. So what are we looking at? God says at the end time, out of persecution, he says, there will arise an innumerable multitude who will wash themselves and have white robes prepared for the return of Jesus Christ. In Russia, in one sense of the word right now, and I'm not saying that these are the innumerable multitude, but what I'm looking at is God gives us physical examples for us to focus on what he's going to do spiritually. Because these people knew what it was like under the Soviet Union. Now they're coming out of the Soviet Union where they have the freedom, and what's going back? Christianity is beginning to filter back into their society. From 31% to 72% in 2008. So it's very interesting. So like here in America, Christianity is reducing. There's been no persecution. They've had their own way. But at some point in time, the persecution will come in. And when it's removed, and there is a truth, you begin to see it, begin to grow. But this time, just before the return of Jesus Christ, God's going to give them the truth. And you and I are part of that work. This is incredible, the work that God's given His people. All of His churches should be focused on the end time return of Jesus Christ, because that is the commission that Jesus Christ gave His disciples when He died. The very first thing He did when He came to this earth, look at it, go back and read the gospel accounts. What's the first thing He says? Repent, for the kingdom of God is at hand. And that's the commission that you and I are commanded to do to this very day. And so that's why we focus on these issues every single week and every single day as we prepare for our program. Okay, let's move on now. The economy. Wow, the economy. It's on fire, or is it? Let's take a look and see what's going on with the economy. The government shutdown. We talked about with the government shutdown. Just yesterday, on Monday, they had another temporary averting of the government shutdown. They're going to go back. 3 weeks later, they're going to come back, and either they'll get a plan this time or they'll shut it down again, and they're going to continue to work on it. So going through all that with the economy, who do we believe? All right, so you hear the pundits on TV, you hear the conservatives, you hear the left, you hear all these people telling us what's going on. Who do you believe? If you were to look at something where the person was actually producing something, what did Jesus say to look at? The fruits. So let's forget about the pundits. Let's forget about all the things that are going on, and let's look at the fruits. So how do we do that? All right, so let's look at the fruits. Here, I'm going to start with this, and then I'm going to bring up the debt clock, right? The actual debt clock that's been going on. November 7th, 2016, this was the time of the election. Remember the election? Well, that's the Dow on the day of 2017 at its close, 18,259. All right, so it went up 371 points that day. The following day after the election, the Dow was up to 1,832. That's in November. All right, so now at that time, I want to bring this out. At that time, the WTI crude oil, which affects you and I, your heating oils, your gas, food, everything, was at $44.94 a barrel. Why is that important? I'm show you in just a second. January 20th, 2017. This was the day that Donald Trump took office. And by the way, when I show you the debt clock, I literally have 1 year ago, at the very moment when he began to raise his right hand and take the oath of office, I actually got a snapshot of the debt clock on the very minute he took office. And by the way, 1 year later, we were here on Saturday morning. We had a little prayer breakfast going on. It was a very wonderful day, very humbling, very emotional. And I asked to be excused in the middle of it because I had to go do one thing. So I went to the fish tank, and at 12 o'clock Eastern time, I took another snapshot of the debt clock. So the debt clocks that I'm going to show you are literally on the very minute that the president took office and the very minute of the year of his first year of candidacy. So now, a month after the election to January 20th, look at the price of crude oil. It went up over $9 a barrel. What was that? What happened? Not a lot, except the emotion or the issue of what was taking place, that things are turning around. So the price of oil went up in 1 month, a little over a month, almost $10. So now, January 19th, 2018, that was Friday, that was last Friday, that was the close of the stock market. The Dow has been up in 1 year 32%. That's in 1 year. That's almost unprecedented. They're saying that this is the first time this has happened since President Roosevelt. Decades ago. So now, crude oil now, look at the price of crude oil, is up to $63. I looked at it this morning before I did the program today. It's almost $65 a barrel. Why am I bringing that out? The crude oil has gone up 41% since last year. See, the crude oil affects you and I. The stock market may or may not, but you will be, one way or the other, you're going to be affected by crude oil. Your car, your gas, the things you cook with, the supplies that you buy, everything uses the crude oil. So now let's look at the stock market. Now I'm bringing you up a chart, and I'm going to bring up another chart in just a few minutes to show you what this means to you and I. Look what happened with the stock market from the 19th, just the day before he took office, and this was to the 4th, January 4th, and it's just over 25 going up to 26. Today it's over 26,000. I think it's 26,200 and something. So, I mean, this chart's not even keeping up. For the first time in history, and I believe it was either 8 or 9 actual working days that the stock market rose over 1,000 points. Never heard of before. It's on a tear. It's on fire. There's euphoria. I heard this morning on the Financial Network is that people who are keeping their money in cash are stupid. I said, wow, how bold is that? They're stupid. This euphoria begins to remind me just before the stock market crash in '29, when the president went out and said, we have literally licked poverty. And everybody had this incredible euphoria. So what's going on now is they're throwing caution to the wind about what's going on here, because it seems like everybody's making money. In the meantime, the stocks are underperforming. All right, so what does that mean? Is that there's a record of how these stocks perform on a percentage, their ratios and their profits, their debts. And if it stays in these ranges, then you're safe. It goes high, you overperform. If it goes less than that, you underperform. So in the emotion of the stocks going up, it's not built on performance. It's built on anticipation. So now why are the stocks going up right now? Well, one of the reasons is they don't have to produce more profit. They just got a tax cut. The tax cut is going to give them the profit. And by putting money into the economy right now, it makes it seem like everybody's doing great. But literally, it's not doing as great as they think. And I'm going to show you. How do you know? You look at the fruits. So now, what I've got here, this is the debt clock that I just took the picture of on January 20th, 2018. All right, so in this debt clock, if you've never seen this before, I'm going to see if I can just give you a brief explanation. Over the next few weeks, we're going to go through lessons in economy based upon God's Word to tell you what we're looking at so that you can make decisions that are going to benefit you and your family. So now, there's the main one that everybody looks at in the upper left-hand corner. That is the national debt. The national debt as of Saturday at noon Eastern stood at $20,612 billion in some change. $20.6 billion. The next thing we're going to cover on the other side is talking about income versus debt. So what I've done is I've circled the boxes. So as we go through this, there's just so much to cover here, it will take weeks to go through. So I want to just take today to show you what it's looking at and just bring out just one or two specific points. All right, so here we have another box where it talks about total debt, interest paid. And interest paid, you're going to be shocked what I'm going to show you right now. Total debt and what's going on. So I'm going to come back to that in just a few minutes. On the bottom gives us the investments of companies per citizen and also the debt, Social Security, the unfunded liabilities, when we show you all of that as we go through. This last box gets more personal and gets you the day-to-day of what's going on. And in it, you'll find the Medicare enrollees, people living in poverty, the people in the workforce. So this here is like a report card. My goal here is not to give a report card on how well or bad the president's doing. I mean, there's enough people doing that. I feel like it's my job to help our people and God's people understand what's going on by the fruits of what's being produced, not by what people are telling us. Then to take those fruits and put them into perspective that the Bible tells us what we look for and how we apply what we've learned. That's what we're doing here today. We're not going to report card on how bad or how good he's doing as a president. I'm looking at the economy and what's taking place. The U.S. debt clock. 1 year in office, the U.S. debt clock. So let's take a look at the last year. All right, this was January 20, 2017. And then you have January 20th, 2018 noon. Exactly 1 year from one another. Now, these are small. All right, so it's kind of hard, and if you got a TV big enough, you can stop and take a look at it. But I'm going to try to zoom them out when I get into specifics. Okay, so here's the U.S. debt 1 year ago. It stood at 19,961. 19,961. The U.S. debt today is at 26,112. All right, so you can see with all the euphoria, with the stock market rising, everybody's making money. This economy is on fire. It's also on fire for its debt. So the debt in America, of all the things that are going on, continued to rise. It went up $651 billion of additional debt in 1 year. And that's with everything going on, with all the positive things that are going on. I want you to remember that 651, because we're going to talk about that in the future. Because you see that figure, and that's what you'll hear, that's fake news. That's not the real figure. But that's the figure that shows up on the debt clock. But when I go back and I look at all the rest of the stuff and I put it together, you can't come up with $651. Why? It's because a lot of the debt that's being accrued is kicked down the road. It doesn't have to be paid for yet. And because it hasn't had to be paid for yet, it's not accounted in the $20.6 trillion. Fake news. So things are worse than they imagine. When you hear somebody say, we're at $20.6 trillion, that is just the tip of the iceberg. Let me show you as we go through here. So now I'm bringing those two numbers back up again. So let's take a look at something. On January 20th, 2009, at noon Eastern, when President Obama took office, the U.S. debt stood at $10.6 trillion. $10.6 trillion. That was, when he took office, he was in office for 8 years. He added in his candidacy to the debt in 8 years, $9.36 trillion in just 8 years. The average U.S. debt per year that he added to the debt clock, $1.1 trillion. So in essence, if I had to compare the two, I'm looking at all things equal. In Donald Trump's first year, he accrued $500 billion or half a trillion dollars less than President Obama accrued. Now, you would think that'd be a pretty good report card, and it is, when you consider how much was going on. But none of it is good. I mean, none of it's good. And when you see the bottom line, it's even worse. It's even worse. All right, so now let's go on. Let's take a look at this bottom. I wish I'd have done this, but I don't think I've got that enlarged enough. It's called the negative gap in the spending versus income. Let's see, pull that up on the screen. Let's see if they can see that, Jeff. Can anybody read that? Wow. All right, so let me see if I can just read it to you what it is. And I'll come back to this next week because I need to blow this up each time because there's so many things in these boxes and you just can't read them. Is that the gap went from $5,638,000,000. In other words, the negative of the income versus the outgo, that's called the gap, versus what we have coming in versus what we got going out, is $5 trillion. But I just showed you that we were only at $651 billion, right? How is that possible? So now let's look at this year, 2017, 5,980 gap. All right, so the gap reduced, but we still had over $5 trillion being added to the bottom line down the road. Now, what's called unfunded liabilities. See, I don't want to get too technical here, but unfunded liabilities. On this box over here, all right, I'm just circling so you can see where I'm at when you pull up on yours. Unfunded liabilities. This means the debt that the government has already assumed to pay for down the road. All right, so that's $104 trillion. There's no way to pay that. But that's coming due at specific periods of time. How do they pay for it? Well, they don't have the income to pay for it, so they sell more bonds, pushing the debt further and further down the road. Last year, it was $104 trillion at that clock. This year, it's up to $111 trillion. In 1 year, the gap I just talked to you about, the $5.6 trillion, that's the real debt. That's how much is we're being assumed the debt's really going out. It's added to a future debt that's not yet due. So when you look at $561 billion, and so, well, that's $500 billion less than last year, we didn't account for over $5 trillion of debt that we assumed to pay for down the road. Can you imagine that? It is impossible to finance. And nobody is telling you the truth on TV. All right? This is the report card. Jesus said you look at the fruits. Well, I'm telling you, this is the fruits. This is reality, and there's no way to wash it down the road. All right, so that's the gap in the next year. The total unfunded liabilities grew $6.8 trillion in 1 year. Unbelievable. And it will escalate as time goes down the road. What else we want to look at? I got one more thing here I want to look at. This is interesting. This is the interest paid on the debt owed by the U.S. The interest. You ready for this? The interest in 1 year, $2.476 trillion last year. This year, $2.6 trillion. So now it grew, the interest alone grew $130 billion over last year. That's per year. Try to imagine what that's looking like. That's just interest on our debt. That's just the interest. This shows that the interest last year grew by $130 billion in 1 year. I started looking at this and said, wow, let me put something together here. That tells me that the interest is being paid out by the government $7.14 billion a day. That's billion, just interest per day. That's $297 million an hour. An hour. That's $4.958 million a second. Every single second, the government spends almost $5 million on interest. Every second of every day. Now, somebody's got to tell me how we get out of this, because there's no way to get out of this. I looked at this today and I said, you know, all the arguments about protecting our country, and the president was asking for, I think it was $20 billion for a wall. What this boils down to? Just under 3 days of interest on our debt. When they talk about, well, $20 billion, how are we going to pay for that? How about all of this? You can see how frustrated I get when you talk about these things. These are real numbers. I'm not making them up. I'm using their report card and sharing with you the reality of what we're looking at. The stock market now. So let me show you something else and bring things into reality. This is the exact same chart I showed you just a few minutes ago about how great things are in the stock market, all right? So now let me bring up three things. You got the Dow, and I'm going to bring up two more arrows. I'm going to show you the income, then I'm going to show you net income. All right, so here we have the income. Look at the rise in income. Just a fraction of a percentage. While the stock market and all the money continues to pour into the Dow, income barely moved. But let me show you what happened to your net. Your bottom line has gone down. In other words, you're in worse shape this year than last year while all this euphoria is going on. So where's all the money going? It's going just the way it's always going. It's going into business, into corporations, into the structure of whatever the governments are given to the economy as far as businesses that everyone goes into. You and I and everyone else who struggles through or seeing a net, and you feel it. Why did I bring up the oil a few minutes ago? Because even though you might get a little bit of rise, so is the price of gas. So is the price of food. And you know what else is going up? Your medical expenses. Everything you can't live without is rising while your income just goes up just a little bit. In all this euphoria, I don't know when. And we may be in the 7 years of plenty. Just like with Egypt, when God says, listen, go store, put things away. you could begin to see some of the type in principle of the 7 years of plenty before you see the 7 years in famine. So here's why I'm bringing all this up now, why I'm going to go through this over the next few weeks, covering little specific points, is you need wisdom going forward. Don't think because you're going to get a raise or you get a bonus that the world's fine, because I just showed you it's not. And at some point, this euphoria will be gone. God talks about that. So now let's bring in a little nugget of this, the insight into the financial world here. Look what God says in Isaiah 29. Therefore the Lord said, inasmuch as these people draw near with me with their mouths and honor me with their lips, but I have removed their hearts far from me, and their fear toward me is taught by the commandment of men. Therefore, behold, I will again do a marvelous work. And that's not a good word, marvelous. It's like, wow, we're having a marvelous time. This is a word, and we'll just explain it later in a future session. This marvelous works mean it's a wonder. It's like terrifying work. He says, I will do a terrifying work among this people, and a marvelous work and a wonder. For the wisdom of the wise men shall perish, God says. The understanding of the prudent men shall be hidden. So when I look at the charts, and I look at the government, and I look at all our leaders and everything they're telling everyone, what am I looking at? I'm looking at this. Their wisdom is gone. The prudent man who'll be able to read what I just shared with you down the road, where this is going to, it's gone. In fact, those who are in Washington today who speak out and say, we cannot sustain this debt, are mocked and laughed and ridiculed and practically just thrown right out of office. Like, who are you to put down this great time that we're having here in America? So anyway, that's what God says, and I'm going to talk more about the prudent. So next week, we're going to get into more on the economy. In our nuggets portion, I'm going to go through the wisdom that God talks about with the prudent against the finances to show how we need to use this information to protect God's people going down the road. So next week, in our nuggets portion, we're going to talk about the prudent and what God says about the prudent and how it applies to you and I today. All right, Mardi Gras. There we are. We're back in Mardi Gras and Did You Know? When we come back, we're going to talk about Did You Know that Satan has a counterfeit plan to destroy mankind and is complete with 3 seasons, 7 holidays, just like God's plan of salvation. So now let's take a break, and we're going to conclude our series and give you that plan now when we come back. So now, we're going to cover that Mardi Gras when we come back, but let's take a break. Let's watch this little video. It's a very inspiring video on the footsteps of the Father, and we'll be right back. Welcome back. I was looking at the clock. I went a lot over time than I wanted to do for that first segment, but it was important. I feel very passionate about the information that I was sharing with you with the persecution and also with the financial picture, because so many of God's people are not prepared for what's coming, and they really need to be prepared. And so in the next few weeks, we'll go through all of those things. All right, so let's talk about Mardi Gras' connection and talk about the plan of God. So this is the third session, and we're going to talk about now the timeline for Mardi Gras. Okay, here's the timeline, and we're going to put it to the plan of God. So December 25th to January 6th is called 12th night. So we talked about that earlier, so this is a review slide here. Brings us to Mardi Gras. And then, as you know, we talked about Mardi Gras, that you cannot point the date for Mardi Gras from Christmas or Twelfth Night. You literally have to go to Easter. So when you try to do it from Christmas, you got a real problem. You cannot establish a time from Christmas to Twelfth Night to set the time for Mardi Gras. To find that time for Fat Tuesday, you must establish the time for Easter and count backways. Very interesting, you have to count backways, and you count backwards actually 7 weeks. Literally, it's 47 days, or 46 days, I'm sorry, and they call it the 40 days of Lent. And they use the 40 days of Lent, which talks about the fasting of Christ for 40 days, but they don't count Sunday. All right, so you have 40 days plus the 6 Sundays in between. Very reminiscent of God's plan. From the wave sheath, God counts 7 weeks forward, even to the morrow after the 7th week is 50 days, brings you to Pentecost. So here we have where God is beginning at Passover and bringing you forward to fruit, producing fruit. Satan has devised a plan to put back ways to Mardi Gras focused on him and his plan. So now, the date of Easter, this is how Easter is calculated in case you didn't know this, has nothing to do with Passover, the death of Jesus Christ. Absolutely amazing. The most important day of their year has nothing to do with Christ. This is how they calculate it. The date of Easter Sunday is calculated to be kept on the first Sunday after the first full moon occurring on or after the spring equinox. That's how it's calculated. Has nothing to do with Passover. Right? That's how you calculate Easter. So now that brings you back to Mardi Gras. Now what's interesting here is Mardi Gras now, that's the connection, that's the central missing link for the plan of salvation, the plan of destruction by Satan. So in the past, we viewed the individual events not on a larger single plan. In other words, we looked at 12th night as one event, Fat Tuesday as an event, and Lent and Easter as another event. However, when you put them together, you see a bigger plan. Just like with God, you have the spring season, and you have Pentecost, and you have the fall. Each one has a specific purpose, but they all tie in together to a larger plan. So does Satan. So what are we looking at? This is God's plan, as we covered in the past, Deuteronomy 16:16, 3 times in the year we come before him. So now, let's look at Satan's plan. The first season he has is Christmas, bringing you to 12th night. Then you have the last part of the season, Lent, bringing you all the way to Easter. In the middle is Fat Tuesday, and so there we have Satan's 3 seasons, all tying together from supposedly the birth of Christ to supposedly the crucifixion of Christ, when never was born on that day, and the Easter has nothing to do with Christ's crucifixion. All right, so we've gone through all that before. Fat Tuesday is the link that connects them all. That's the central point of bringing everything together. The period from Christmas all the way to Fat Tuesday and 12th night is the period of debauchery and sin, a period of time of no hope. Ash Wednesday, the sacrifice and hope for mankind. So there you have the plan of the connection between the two. It is the Fat Tuesday is the day that sin gives way to repentance. Bourbon Street's closed here in New Orleans and around the world. They have their other events. In fact, I was asked an interesting question the other day. It's like, does Mardi Gras have anything to do with the rest of the world? He says, because it seems like everybody seems to be involved in some way, shape, or form. Here's what you need to remember. Whether they have a Mardi Gras or not, if they're tied into the Catholic Church and the Protestant who come out of that, Lent is tied to Mardi Gras. And every Catholic keeps Lent. So whether they have Mardi Gras or not, it's all tied into the plan of deception. So whether it has Fat Tuesday in your area or not, it doesn't matter. The plan is in place. So then at midnight, we showed you before how Rex, the king of Carnival, meets with Comus of all the festivities. They bring it to a close. At that midnight, the church opens up on what's called Ash Wednesday, and people go in and takes like the sacrifice of Christ on a Wednesday, which the Bible talks about that Christ was crucified in the midst of the weeks, and begins to repent and bring them all the way to Easter. All right, so God's calendar plan stands with Satan's counterfeit plan. Let me put this together and put it down where we can all understand what's going on. This is absolutely amazing. And I know I've never seen it before, this way before. So we're going to put it together to the plan of what we're talking about. In God's plan, we talked about here, I'm putting in the calendars, and then we're going to go back and we're going to bring in God's calendar for his 7 months for his plan of salvation and his holy days. All right, so there. Passover is either in April or March, because God's calendar is based on the Hebrew calendar, not the Roman calendar that people use today. So God's calendar is 360 days, and every now and then you got a 13th year being put in. So at some point in time, there's either a 13-month or a 12-month period. So Passover will fall sometime in late March or April, and sometimes with the rest of the day will be September, October for the fall holy days. Then you have, after Passover, you have the 7 days of unleavened bread, and what's very important in the way is the wave sheath that falls in between the two holy days on God's spring holy days. And it always fell on a Sunday. It was on the morrow after the Sabbath, was the counting that God gave the Hebrews, which is interesting because of that. Easter is always pinned on Sunday because Satan doesn't want you to look at the time that pictures the ascension of Christ back to heaven. All right, so here we have the 7 weeks going forward. On the morrow after the Sabbath brings you to the fall holy days, and there you have God's plan. Now, Passover being on a Wednesday, the wave sheath was always on a Sunday. All right, that's the first time when Christ was actually crucified was always on a Wednesday. It doesn't always fall on a Wednesday anymore because God's days do not coincide with the Roman holiday or the Roman calendar. You have to understand that Passover is always the 14th day of the first month on God's calendar. That's why it always moves. The only thing doesn't is the pinning of the wave sheet that always fell on the morrow after the Sabbath, inclusive of the holy days. That is why Easter was always pinned on a Sunday. Easter always falls on a Sunday also. So it's a counterfeit plan. Now, we're going to give you, in the next couple weeks, another sermon. It's going to be called The Greatest Deception Ever Perpetrated on Mankind. And we're going to go through, like we did with Christmas and like we did with Mardi Gras, we're going to go through Easter and show you how that plan of deception was put into place. Satan's holiday season comes to a close on Easter as God's holy day season begins on Passover, all around the same time. Now, it goes back ways from Easter coming all the way back into November for Satan's plan. So now let's put these together in Satan's counterfeit plan and put them together. So God's holy days start in April. Satan's holidays start in October. Now, sometimes it's March and sometimes it's September. I'm using these dates today just for purposes of explaining the time. Either one shifts, the 7 months shifts. It's still with a 7-month plan. So this is what we have in God's plan for salvation. All right. You have the months that God's plan is from April to October, and Satan's plan is from October to April. Just the opposite. See how they reverse one another? Is that Satan is always trying to step in on God's plan, and you'll see them reverse. And so it's like Satan tries to anchor around God's plan so nobody, so like keeping it into a little button. All right, so now we have the months. We have the 7 months coming in of the holy days or his holidays. Now, these are God's calendar months, and you'll see that God's calendar always begins on the 1st of Nisan or Iyar, and so you have all the way through on the Hebrew months you're looking at that I just wanted to put in for everyone's information. So now I'm taking that chart, and I just reduced it so I can explain to you now what we're looking at. God's plan is 7,000 years. Like a week, 7 days, or 7,000 years. He has 7 holy days, and it takes place during the growing months. So in God's plan, around March or April is the springtime is coming in, the seasons are warming up, the time for planting and for growing, producing fruit. Just like we said with the financial debt clock, that's the fruit. You always go by the fruit. It also has a plan that takes 7 days in a week. Satan's plan of deception is 7,000 years, 7 holidays, and also takes place during the non-growing months. So as the season comes to a close and winter's coming in, there's no more production. Well, that's when Satan's plan kicks into place because he wants to destroy all fruit. He also talks about 7 days in the week. All right, so now you got the exact same thing going on. So now God's holy days. All right, here's God's holy days, and if you're new to this, you need to understand the holy days. Go to Leviticus 23. God has 7 holy days. Passover is not a holy day. That's the crucifixion of Christ. But the days of unleavened bread has 2 holy days, a first day and the 7th day, 2 holy days. The next holy day is in Pentecost, which is 50 days later. And you see that Acts 2 people talk about with the birth of the New Testament church. You also see it in the Old Testament at the time of the giving of the law in Exodus 20. Then in the fall season, you have trumpets, atonement, tabernacles, and the last great day. You have 4 holy days that complete the 7 days that are in the fall season that center around the return of Jesus Christ, the millennial reign, and the new heaven and the new earth in the second resurrection with the last great day. All right, so there's God's 7 holy days. Now let's look at Satan. You have Christmas. So then here we have 12th night, Mardi Gras, Lent, Good Friday, and Easter. All right, so that's 6. We're missing 1. All right, so what day are we missing in God's plan? All right, Halloween, which is called All Souls Day, which is on October 31st every year, and All Souls Day is November 1st. It is the beginning of Satan's plan. It reminds us of something else. Here's what it reminds us of, because you see, he has to have a counterfeit of everything that God has. The counterfeit is in this. Genesis 1, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Now, what are we looking at with Easter and the All Souls Day? It is a time when we see the spirits of the dead come to life and inhabit this world. It was seen as a time when the boundary between this world and the other world thinned, and the spirits of the dead roamed the earth. Just like we're looking at in Genesis chapter 1, when God's Spirit roamed the earth, when Satan's playing at the beginning of his 7 months, he has his spirits roaming the earth, just like God. And so what we're looking at is a complete counterfeit plan of God. All right, so there you have it. The plan of God, Satan, the counterfeit, just like we have with God's plan. But there's one more day that Satan has introduced to create the complete counterfeit. Because when you look at Leviticus 23, you see that the very first holy day that God says we're to keep is the Sabbath day. So Satan also has to change that day also. So on this vital piece, the one last missing piece in this plan, it is the weekly connection of God's people to Him, which is established from creation, which is the Sabbath day. So with the Sabbath being changed to a Sunday, the day of sun worship, the day that Jesus Christ tells us is a day, the Sabbath day, is the day to refrain from our work to draw close to Him. Satan has taken that day now and moved it to Sunday, the day of sun worship. And he has placed his most important day of his plan of deception on a Sunday and Sunday morning. You can read about that in Ezekiel chapter 8. And we're going to talk about that in the next time I deliver the sermon, the greatest fraud ever perpetrated on mankind, and how this world has bought this lock, stock, and barrel. Leviticus 23, verses 2 and 3 said, this is the beginning. It begins with the Sabbath day, and it says, speak to the children of Israel, and say unto them concerning the feast of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my feasts. 6 days shall work be done, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. That day is critical to be kept. But not only that day, as we just showed you, all of God's holy days that are still in place. And so if you're keeping the Sabbath and you're still keeping Christmas and Easter, you need to do something and repent to begin to keep God's holy days, not Satan's plan of deception. In Exodus 31, God says this. This is the way God says that we are His people. Truly my Sabbaths you shall keep It is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord that does sanctify you. The fact that you keep the Sabbath day is how God separates us from the rest of the world, and He sets us apart as holy people on His Sabbath day. Well, there you have it, Satan's plan of deception for mankind. All right, let's begin to wrap this up. We're just about at 60 minutes already, a little longer than we wanted to be. So here's from the home office coming in this week. We got two DVDs going out. We're going to be sending out the Mardi Gras Hiding in Plain Sight. If you haven't got your copy, you need to get it in right away so we can send that to you. And also we're going to be sending you part 1 of the News Nuggets and Insights series that we began 3 weeks ago. So you'll get part 1 in the mail coming to you this coming week. Also, we're going to be on the road again. This week we're going to be up in Whitwell, Tennessee, which is just east of Chattanooga. And this is our little church building up there. It's on the Cartwright Loop in Whitwell, Tennessee. So if you need to get information on how to get there, you can contact Chuck Baker. His phone number is 812-595-6705. Or you can call Rachel and Jeremy Connor at 423-570-9960. Our services start at 12 noon on the Eastern or 11 Central. And we put that time in all the time because they're almost on the borderline. So if you live on one side of the town, you're in the Eastern, and on the other side, you're in the Central time zone. So they call it a slow time or regular time. And slow time is the Central Standard Time, which is an hour behind the other. So anyway, noon Eastern or 11 Central, if you're in the area, please stop by and visit. We're going to have a nice turnout. And we're going to be welcoming Chuck Baker, who's going to be taking over that congregation in just a few weeks and help serve them like he's done down in Florida for so many years. Well, there you have it. That's our program for this week, News Nuggets and Insights. We have one more video, and as we always try to do, we want to close with an inspirational video. And today we're going to share one with you that we showed you earlier in the year, but it's well worth seeing. So let's play that video now, Creation.
In the beginning, God created heavens and the earth. The opening lines to a beautiful story. A story about us and God. It all began with an empty slate, a world without form. He was there, hovering over the waters, and he spoke. Let there be light. And it was done. He took the light and separated it from the darkness, creating day and night, and the stage was set. With the light and dark separated, he went to create the sky by dividing the water, and the land by pulling it out of the sea. Next was life, plants, trees, flowers, grass. He saw his work, and it was good. He continued. He added skies filled with birds and oceans filled with fish, lands filled with animals, and something more. He gave his first commandment, to go and make more. So the earth was filled with life. And then the story zooms into us. He created this garden stage, this platform for something. Scooping his hands into the earth, he formed a human in his own image, man. But something separated this man from the rest of creation. Something simple, something breathed, something called life.
What a great little video. I love that video. I mean, the graphics, the inspiration behind it, and the video, the music, I mean, it just really just pulls everything together. Well, I hope you enjoyed our program today. So that's it for News Nuggets and Insights for this week. Hope everyone's keeping warm. And as we move forward to another program next week, God be with you.